I think I stretched it. Oops, I didn't record. Hey, good to see you, friends. Today a news story is going viral online. That under one of the 3 pyramids that make up the Giza pyramid complex, something truly extraordinary has been discovered. Specifically, we're talking about 8 cylindrical structures like pillars that go as deep as 600 meters. There are supposed to be 2 chambers, each 80 meters in size, so 2 cubic chambers with sides of about 80 meters. Moreover, around these cylindrical structures, there would be some spiral staircases so that you could go down to those chambers. And even more than that, at that depth, so over 600 meters, some tunnels almost 2 kilometers long would have been discovered, which would connect these chambers to other structures that would indeed be at that depth, under the complex of the 3 pyramids at Giza. Please watch the video until the end because I will discuss 2 aspects, the technical aspect of the problem and the conspiratorial aspect. Let me start with the second one. The news has exploded in this conspiratorial area where it's been said for a long time that the pyramids are something truly extraordinary, that people couldn't have built them, that maybe even an extraterrestrial civilization made them, and the structures that are claimed to have been discovered now would actually be the proof that this is true. However, there is also a technical side because many of you have asked me, okay, but how were those measurements actually made? How was it possible to determine structures that go as deep as 600 meters into the earth?
What technique did they use?
And then, to be honest, I was very open this time. So I didn't get into this story quickly, and it took me more than a day to read. I don't even remember a few articles. Yeah, not too many. A few articles, a few videos. There are videos in Italian that I had to watch with English subtitles, websites, and so on. So when I searched a lot about this story, I tried to stay open to the possibility that this intervention, this discovery, could be real. And please watch the video until the end. Let's see first what they measured. The result is in the picture here. Here we see a depth scan, so the height of the picture is, I don't know, about 800 meters, a depth scan. Under one of the pyramids at Giza, the Pyramid of Khafre, which is the second pyramid. So it's not the Great Pyramid of Giza, it's the second pyramid. And if we look at the picture, we can indeed recognize some structures that are cylindrical. Following this measurement, those who conducted the measurements, a group of Italians, also made this drawing. Yes, and in this drawing you can see the 8 cylindrical structures, but you can also see around them and some kind of spirals. That spiral would represent an open area, it would represent some stairs through which those above could go down. In the next picture, we see such a column, such a cylinder with the spiral around it. And further on, if we look at this picture, we see all 4 columns, each with a spiral, so each with a staircase going down into the 2 chambers I told you about, which would be about 80 meters wide, high, and deep. And here we see a kind of zoom out, so it's also a depth scan, but on a much larger scale. In the central part, the dark central area represents the area beneath the pyramid. And these structures, which are bright and stretch along roughly horizontal lines, would be those tunnels I mentioned at the beginning. They would be artificial structures, according to the Italian researchers who presented the data. And they are at a depth of about 2 kilometers. And stretch over a distance of about 2 kilometers as well. Of course, beneath that plateau at Giza. It's good, sir, isn't it? Are these measurements really legit? Because if they are, it's truly a historic thing, no doubt about it. And I started this thing with the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I said, well, maybe they're right. I'm going to look at the measurements and we'll talk briefly soon about the measurements. But now let me tell you a bit about my experience because I discovered that they come from a conspiratorial background. These results were announced a few weeks ago, at a public conference in Italian, in the Italian language, by 3 Italian researchers. They have a conspiratorial background. I mean, they wrote articles, they wrote books suggesting that these pyramids were not made by humans, that they might actually be constructions made by extraterrestrials, that they would be some kind of power plants, sorts of energy centers, and that they might be portals in time. And this pseudo-scientific label, this conspiratorial label, surprisingly appears in scientific articles and even in their presentations. In the only scientific article they published, they talk about how the pyramids might have been made by extraterrestrials. And moreover, at this conference which took place, I don't remember exactly 2 or 3 weeks ago, they had a poster, yes, in which they wrote there, time portal, a poster like this, which really resembles that conspiracy stuff. And it clearly says that this pyramid would actually be a time portal, of course, built by aliens. Because who else could we be talking about, right? And this conspiracy thing is made even more suspicious by the fact that it's in Italian. I watched those conferences, there are 2 of them, and I had to listen in Italian with automatic translation. Attention in English, so I didn't even have subtitles in English. And it's kind of shielded, that's how I felt. I couldn't find information in English. I couldn't find information I could rely on in English. The lady, who is the spokesperson for these researchers, has a YouTube channel, and when she speaks in English, she reads from a sheet of paper. As the spokesperson, I expected her to explain the essence of the phenomenon. Sir, what is it? No, not at all. She repeats what's said in Italian with a translation, which is, well, and she doesn't say very much. Yes, so it's a closed area. I found only one guy on Facebook. I think his name was Trevor. I hope I can put his name here somewhere. He was in contact with them, and then after that, this guy managed to bring up some photos and give us more information. But the general situation is as follows. People really want to know, so I'm talking about the whole internet, sir. People really want to know what the truth is. Are the measurements accurate? What can we do? Because then you go down, you want to see those tunnels, you want to see those cylinders and so on. They want to know, are these measurements accurate? Either they're in a conspiracy zone, they only talk in Italian, and scientific information comes out in dribs and drabs. It's like you have to pull it out, like with pliers. Yeah, that's pretty much how you have to get it out. And you can see that. Now, I say let's move on to the technical information. Let's put aside, at least for now, the conspiracy theories and see if these measurements are actually real or not. The method they use is based on a well-known way of scanning the Earth's surface. That method is called synthetic aperture radar. So, it's a radar that uses electromagnetic waves with a frequency of about, if I'm not mistaken, 6 or 7 gigahertz. We're probably talking about microwaves, a microwave radar. So, we're talking about a satellite that moves around the Earth at an altitude, actually not height, but altitude, of 600 kilometers, and that satellite scans the surface of the Earth. I'll explain more later, but just so you get the big picture. So, the big picture is that this satellite scans the surface of the Earth and makes maps of the Earth's surface, using a method called synthetic aperture radar. Normally, this method can only scan to a depth of, let's say, about 1 meter. That's about the range you get with this method. Not more than that, because radar waves can't penetrate deeper, since they're absorbed by the Earth. So then, how were the Italian researchers able to measure at a depth of 2 kilometers using this technique? Well, here's the trick. They say, sir, we don't use this synthetic aperture radar method the way all the other researchers do. We actually use a version of it invented by us, which is called Doppler synthetic aperture radar. I'm not saying this was reproach to the Italian researchers. Like, hey, how do you use this method and measure down to this depth of 2 kilometers, since this method doesn't measure that? And they say, but we don't use this one. We changed it to measure in depth. We're bringing something entirely new. Good. And so in order to explain to you and get to what Doppler synthetic aperture radar means, right? I need to explain to you as quickly as I can each of the 4 words in reverse order. So let me explain them to you. In short, please don't leave the channel. Radar methods for scanning the Earth's surface appeared between the years 1980 and 1990. They are very good in any field, including the military, because with their help, you can get images of the Earth's surface even when there are clouds. And you can imagine those guys from the military field when they said, hey, what? Very good. Because we already have our own satellites that spy using optical telescopes placed on satellites. This time we have, so to speak, microwave radar that scan the surface of the Earth. In the radar range, 8 gigahertz, and so the radar waves pass through clouds. Then we can see what's happening inside the Earth. I read that radar still works when it's cloudy, but I'm not sure about rain. How does this kind of radar function? Well, basically, you have the satellite that sends out a pulse of an electromagnetic signal, let's say at 6 gigahertz, towards the Earth's surface, and then the signal comes back. You know, the distance, what interests you is the amplitude of the signal, meaning the signal can be reflected. Let's say that down here at the very bottom, there's something metallic or not. It can be reflected. Or it reflects less because of what you have there on the Earth's surface, and you get a lower amplitude. Or if the satellite moves across the sky at an altitude of 600 kilometers, it sends a pulse, the signal comes back. You say it reflected here, it goes further and sends a pulse. It doesn't reflect that much because the signal that comes back is weak. You say, okay, here I have a different type of soil. Because it didn't reflect, it moves further. Again, check if it reflects more or less. This way, you scan the Earth's surface and color it based on how much it reflected. Yes, if you have some, I don't know, metallic military trucks, bam, they reflect the signal. If you have, I don't know, open ground, maybe that reflects less. And then you've managed to scan that strip, and in that way you have a portion of the image. Now you realize that I'm explaining it in a very, very simplified way, because like this, I've only scanned a single line. We're interested in also scanning in the second dimension, which depends on the antenna construction. On the other hand, yes, there is a fundamental problem with these radars, namely that you need to have a very, very large antenna in order to have minimal resolution, very small here. So it's like with optical telescopes, the larger the mirror you have, the better the resolution of the image you get. But because the radar wavelength is on the order of centimeters, yes, the wavelength is much larger than the optical wavelength. The wavelength in the optical domain is on the order of, let's say, half a micrometer. Because of these things, these regular radar antennas don't have good resolution. They have much worse resolution than an optical telescope. That's what happened with the first satellites, yes, that were sent into space. There was one, Cosmos 1500, I think, from the Soviets in the 80s, which scanned such an area for the first time, and the resolution back then was very poor. 1 pixel was about 2 kilometers. I've already said 2 words. Aperture radar. Why? Because the resolution with which that satellite radar can see down on the Earth's surface depends on the aperture. So it depends on how big the radar antenna is. And at sizes of tens of meters, I said that you get resolutions of 2 kilometers, which are insufficient. Too poor. Now, this is where the third word comes in, which means synthetic. That is synthetic, namely, what they did. Well, they said this. Sir, we have a 20-meter antenna, and because of that, the resolution is poor. But actually, that antenna moves with the satellite over the surface of the Earth. And if I allow the antenna at some point to receive the signal from several areas on Earth to also receive the signal from the previous area, yes, then, essentially, I can look at this whole system like a much larger antenna, described by the entire curve along which the satellite moves. So that antenna can even be kilometers long. And then you gain resolution this way. They are able to create images of the ground with resolutions on the order of 20 centimeters. 20 centimeters, radar through clouds. Just so we're clear on military technology, these numbers are likely better, but we aren't aware of them. This is synthetic aperture radar with a resolution of tens of centimeters. However, keep in mind it creates an image of the surface. And the Italian researchers refer to a company. They probably have connections with that company which sells such data. So that satellite collects all the data, their company analyzes that data and provides images. Do you want to see what the agricultural lands look like in Burigan? Who else? I know, someone else cut down some trees in the forests of Fagarash. Hey, this resolution allows you to do these measurements even when it's cloudy. The problem is that these are surface measurements and you can go to a depth of about 1 meter. I mean, if you adjust some parameters, you can determine the quality of the agricultural land, let's say, but you can't go deeper than about 1 meter. And this brings us to the Italians' invention. The people say this, gentlemen. We managed to find a method to scan with this synthetic aperture radar system at a greater depth underground. And we call this method Doppler synthetic aperture radar. And their method is somewhat counterintuitive because it's not actually about scanning. From what I've seen in their articles, they started with this method when they studied the ships they could see from space using the PUPS satellite. I didn't register it. I have to repeat here. So, these Italian researchers measured the ships that were in the port. And if the ship is stationary, everything is fine, it's a regular measurement. But if the ship is moving, the signal that is reflected by the ship and comes back will have a different frequency. Because of the Doppler effect? No, the Doppler effect, what is this Doppler effect? We see it with cars. As one approaches, it sounds one way, and as it leaves, it sounds another. So, when it's coming, the sound frequency is higher. When it's leaving, the sound frequency is lower. Yes, good. What about these ships? They move around. So what then? The movement of the ship contributes to the signal that comes from the radar on the satellite. And the signal, when it returns, has a different frequency, which is given by the movement of the ship. What's important isn't the ship's speed or constant movement, but even when it's docked in port. Because they said we can see if there are very strong winds or very big waves in that port. And then the ship vibrates, and by vibrating this ship, yes, it introduces frequency changes in the signal that returns to the radar. So from our radar signals, we can tell if there are very strong winds in that port. Because we see how the ship oscillates and slightly changes the frequencies that come back to the radar. That's where the name of their method comes from. Doppler synthetic aperture radar. So to be clear, it's a new method. And the others said they had nothing to comment on because synthetic aperture radar can't measure at depth, right? They're doing something completely new. And they applied this method to ships. At the pyramid, they took the Pyramid of Giza, and in the article from 2022, they show us how they measured the internal structure of the Giza pyramid. Yes, based on these radar signals reflected by the pyramid back to their satellite at 600 kilometers altitude. Of course, be careful, this is not the usual method because the usual method will only scan the surface of the pyramid. The usual method doesn't tell you at all what's inside the pyramid. Careful, here's the trick. This is the trick. Hey, they say, let's consider that this pyramid is a single solid block, right? And let's imagine it very simply. Well, since I don't have this glass and I can't take it, I'll take this mug, okay? If I hit this mug, I hear it in a certain way, right? If this mug were empty, it would sound different. Why? Because the propagation of sound and the waves formed by sound depend a lot on the internal structure of the mug. If it has something inside, if it has water, and so on. So, they say, somehow in a way we still haven't understood very well, they say this, sir, this pyramid vibrates. It vibrates due to vibrations induced by external factors, such as, for example, a small earthquake. This earthquake happens almost daily. They are very, very small. We can't hear them. Yes, since the pyramid is large, it reacts and moves. And it moves, they say it's visible. Look at this chart. This chart is from the article where it shows how the pyramid moves. right? At these vibrations that they measured, because they can measure these vibrations, I told you, from the Doppler effect. And if you look at the vertical scale, you'll see their displacements on the order of 0.01 micrometers. 0.01 micrometers, it's very little. And it's normal for it to be little because those are micro-earthquakes. But they say we can measure this displacement of 0.01 micrometers of the pyramid because of the earthquakes, the mini-earthquakes. I think that's possible. I mean, I have no doubt about that because I tell myself, okay, that signal would depend on how good that radar is. You have to calculate the frequency shift, and this might actually be true. Now, however, they have to solve the inverse problem, and that's what they claim they've solved. The inverse problem, namely that this pyramid is moving. Not only because of earthquakes, they say, but also because of the wind blowing and because of the commotion in the city of Cairo, meaning the trucks driving around there cause mini earthquakes and so on. Yes, and because of that, you see here, the variations are random, but these variations depend on the internal structure of the pyramid. So if we imagine the pyramid as a completely rigid object, yes, it has a certain way it moves, but if it has internal structures, internal cavities, then it moves somewhat differently. And I can imagine that if the cavity is at the top, for example, it moves. It tilts in a certain way. If there's a cavity at the bottom, it tilts in a different way during small earthquakes and so on. And they say they've solved this inverse problem. That is, they've measured this micro movement of the upper walls of the pyramid because once again, they can only measure the waves reflected from the top part of the pyramid. Yes, so they've measured this micro movement of the pyramid's walls, and this micro movement is an indication of the internal structure. And they've solved the inverse problem. That is, from this micro movement, based on some very, very complex transformations, they managed to give us an image of the internal structure of the pyramid. So, a kind of tomography, so to speak. Attention! In their article, the Italian researchers say that the vibration of the pyramid's walls is measured individually for each pixel. The vibrations are different for different portions of the pyramid's walls. The way each part of it vibrates differently is determined by its shape and internal structure. Here, honestly, they lost me, but they didn't really lose me. Because they might not be right. Because they might be right. I don't see any physical principle that says they couldn't be right, but they lost me. Because the article is very complex. So I imagine it's possible. But sir, to solve this inverse problem, determining the pyramid's internal structure from its movement, you'd also need to know the source, since that's much easier if it's known. Because if you know where you're hitting, and you listen on the other side, or measure the vibrations from this side, then you can solve the inverse problem more easily, because you know where you hit it. So, if you know where the earthquake is coming from, so to speak, from which direction, and how the pyramid is vibrating, or where the sound is coming from, and so on. My message is that it doesn't seem impossible, just difficult. And people, they might be right, you might be right. I was confused, so to speak, but the conference was in Italian, and I didn't find it in the article. I didn't understand why these interactions would play a role. But let me summarize for you. First, I can't say whether the article is true or not. Second, it might be true. And I shouldn't stop. Because they show in their conference how they would have checked these results on other structures. I mean, they measured under the Gran Sasso laboratory, which is under a mountain in Italy, so basically they scanned the outer surface of the mountain. They used Doppler to measure vibrations and deduced the internal structure. And the drawing they found and that you see here, they claim it matches very well. Attention! The new results, which were announced a few weeks ago, are for the Pyramid of Khafre, so not the Pyramid of Khufu. This is the article from 2022 where they check the method with the internal structure, but the new results are for these structures. 8 cylinders were found beneath the Pyramid of Khafre, and the method used is the same. And why did this method work? Because most likely those cylinders are rigidly connected to the pyramid. And then we're talking about a rigid block which vibrates and also has some indentations. Those cylinders that are again connected to the 2 chambers, and which are further connected, possibly, to the other tunnels. Yes. And so this method works, especially because essentially we're talking about a rigidity that goes from the pyramid to the cylinders, which then goes towards the other tunnels. Once again, and we have to say this, so it's not about the synthetic aperture radar method by which we measure in depth. It's about a method adapted with a body that is somewhat rigid and that vibrates. And from these vibration measurements, we detect not only the internal structure of the body, as it was at Giza, but now also the external shape of the body, which I now imagine as a pyramid with some pillars going deep and with 2 chambers here possibly, and with some tunnels. All of these should somehow form a structure. Because you realize, if those tunnels are not connected at all, rigidly, with a certain rigidity to the pyramid, then it's pointless for the pyramid to vibrate and for them to measure the pyramid's vibration from the outside. Because they couldn't say anything about the tunnels here. For the tunnels here to stand out, they also need to move a little in sync with the pyramid. And here we enter the last part of the presentation. Because there are 2 things I want to add. One, that the images don't have such good resolution. I mean, if we look at these images with their scanned structure of the inside of the pyramid, if we just look at them, it's hard to tell where a chamber is and where there's stone. And if we overlay them with the actual images from inside the pyramid, we see that they somewhat overlap. So in other words, there is some truth there, but the images don't have very good resolution. One more thing might be most important to me. If their method works, it could revolutionize archaeology. Why? First, let's understand the method's principle. You can't scan just any surface of the ground. You need to have a somewhat rigid structure to scan. You measure its vibrations, and from those vibrations, you find its internal structure. But it could truly revolutionize archaeology. Why? Because you scan buildings, for example, the ones in Rome. You scan the buildings in Paris. Oh, we know that in Rome, the buildings are connected to structures that go underground. Or in Paris, again, the structures are connected to what we have beneath Paris. The buildings are connected to what is under Paris. So if the method is really good, it's truly revolutionary, because you would be doing archaeology. From the height of some satellites, you could find out how those structures extend. Like that, they spread their roots, so to speak, underground to a certain depth and so on. And that seems somehow extraordinary to me, especially for the Italian researcher who talked about these technical things. He must have realized that if this technology is very, very good, it can revolutionize archaeology. You do archaeology from the height of a satellite. At that moment, he should have disconnected this part from the conspiracy side, because then scientists would have paid him much, much, much more attention. And we've reached the ending part. Conclusions. Do I think it's real? Surprisingly for me, since I started out skeptical, I'm thinking the technical part might actually be true. Those images have poor resolution. Be careful. I think this explains the whole story. I mean, maybe there aren't structures, cylinders, with internal stairs, with tunnels and so on under the pyramid. Yes, maybe these things aren't there. Maybe these things were introduced into the story by the other 2 Italian researchers whom I told you wrote books in this conspiracy field. I mean, they said, finally, our theory is proven. The pyramids were built by aliens. Maybe the explanation is in the middle. Maybe this method manages to give an image of what exists, approximate and with many errors. Yes, you saw that the images are not very clear of what is under the pyramids, and maybe under the pyramids, by the way, under the pyramids. We know that we have a foundation, and I read that this foundation would have a depth of about 27 meters. This is what we're circling around. Yes, maybe that foundation has a structure that extends further, beyond those 27 meters. Maybe the engineers at that time somehow dug even deeper, not down to 600 meters. Careful, no. But maybe they dug another 50 meters. More than that, I don't know. Well, and if indeed that foundation had some areas that stick out like some kind of cylinders, Yes. And if this scanning method is still in its early stages, it still doesn't give very good results. When it analyzes, it exaggerates, so to speak. So, basically, the area where those cylinders go down to 600 meters deep is actually exaggerated. The software made a mistake there. Somehow it went out of bounds. It made an extrapolation that wasn't very good. And I'm saying this, yes, also because I read it somewhere, I can't remember where. They meant artificial intelligence, which seemed extremely dangerous to me, because artificial intelligence is trained on structures. So, if you use artificial intelligence here, it means you already have some expectations, which artificial intelligence also has. Think about ChatGPT, yes. It's very dangerous to use artificial intelligence at this early stage, because it can give you something you're expecting. But maybe that's not true. So to conclude this video, which I hope isn't an hour long, here's my final thought. So my conclusion is that this method could be true. The results show us part of the internal structure or part of the structure beneath the pyramid, only with a very, very poor resolution. And then the software didn't work that well, and it extrapolated. Maybe something lies deeper under the pyramid, I think. The extrapolations that were included in these drawings we see are basically extrapolations. They're not extrapolations, they're drawings added by researchers, by the other two researchers who are on this conspiracy side. So there might be something under the pyramid. But we're not talking about cylinders up to 600 meters. We're not talking about stairs, but internal ones. That would be around those cylinders for people to go down there. We're not talking about structures 2 kilometers deep. If there were tunnels and those 2 chambers they would move through, we're not talking about that. And with that, we've reached the end. Thank you if you stayed with me. Don't forget to visit my Patreon page as well, because there you'll truly find something special. In the sense that I'm trying to promote my Patreon page, and if you become one of my subscribers, then I can answer your questions directly on Patreon. That's it for today. You should know that I have also prepared a study for a video in which I will speak freely, and it will be about consciousness. Giulio Toloni Consciousness. Until next time, I'm Christian Pressura. I'll see you and wish you all the best. Goodbye.